Wrap up 2024 with a solution that helps you do more with less. Unwrap case management tools built for personal injury firms. With features like automated calendar reminders and all-in-one document management, CasePeer keeps your cases on track from start to finish. Unwrap the gift of CasePeer by December 31st and get a $250 gift card. Terms and conditions apply. Claim offer at www.casepeer.com.
Welcome to the DC Bar's Brief Encounters podcast. I am Tilly Moore, Chair of the Human Rights and Immigration Subcommittee of the International Law Community at the DC Bar. This is the third of our speaker series on international principles and standards for democratic elections and governance in this historic year of elections, with over 80 countries having had or holding national elections affecting more than half the world's population. According to a recent Freedom House analysis, most democracies held free and fair elections in 2024. Reassuringly, there were no attempts to prevent a peaceful transfer of power during this year's contests. On the other hand, in countries with weak or non-existent democratic institutions, electoral manipulations, that is, attempts to skew the playing field to aid the incumbent, were widespread. In countries rated partly free and not free, in Freedom House's Freedom in the World ranking, incumbents attempted to stifle competition by excluding opponents in 20 of 35 contests. Violence against political candidates, targeting polling places, and during post-election protests was also a major factor in 26 elections globally. Today, however, we will speak with two global democracy experts about how this historic year of elections is now transitioning into a historic year of governance around the world and in the United States. With us is Thomas Garrett. Tom is currently a practitioner in residence and distinguished global democracy lecturer in the Cornell Brooks School of Public Policy. He is also the immediate former Secretary General of the Community of Democracies, a global intergovernmental coalition of member states, including the United States, coordinating efforts on the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. In 2024, the Government of Romania conferred the National Order of Merit Grand Officer on Tom for his work on behalf of human rights and democracy. Previously, Tom was Vice President of Global Programs at the International Republican Institute, a nonpartisan organization supporting elections, civil society, and democratic governance around the world. He began his national career at the U.S. Department of the Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs as the Director of Congressional and Legislative Affairs and Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs. Also with us today is Tova Wang. Tova is the Director of Research Projects in Democratic Practice with the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School. Tova previously served as Director of Policy and Research at the Center for Secure and Modern Elections, where she worked on voter registration reform and led research on how to develop transformative strategies for increasing political participation among marginalized groups. She has over 20 years of experience working on improving democracy and is focused on issues relating to greater political inclusion in the United States, including major studies on increasing voter participation rates among low-income people, communities of color, naturalized immigrants, women, and Native American. She is also the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Politics of Voter Suppression, Defending and Expanding Americans' Right to Vote. She has advised international organizations on voting rights, election reform, and constitutional reform in countries around the world. Her commentary on voting and participation has appeared in myriad media outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, The Hill, and Political, as well as numerous TV and radio shows. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It would be really useful, I think, for our listeners to know a bit more about what drew you to research and advocate for better democratic standards, both here in the United States and around the world. Perhaps if we could start with you, Tova.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I had always been interested in human rights and human rights law in law school. I keep meaning to edit my bio because it's really more like 25 years now. I really got my start in doing this work in 2000 in the wake of the infamous Bush-Gore election and aftermath, and worked for the Carter-Ford Commission, which was established at that time to assess the election and what went wrong and come up with recommendations led by former Presidents Carter and Ford, and off I went. And so that has now developed into a career of working on how to advance democracy and more inclusive democracy that has led me to the Kennedy School now, which is the place where I sort of sit and do this research work and writing work now.
Thank you for that. Tom, what about you?
So I was active in politics when I was at college in my early 20s, and went from politics, election campaigns, into actually being a professional campaign consultant. That led me onto a presidential election, and that led me into the federal government eventually. You talked about my time at the Department of the Interior, where I was a political appointee. When that administration came to an end, sort of out of the blue, an offer came to travel to Ukraine and teach grassroots campaign tactics to first-time candidates in one of those first parliamentary elections in Ukraine. And so I went and did that, thinking it would be a one-off, one-time activity. And while I was there, I was so impressed by the people who were trying to emerge out of the Soviet Union, trying to understand this democracy, this system that they were suddenly a part of. And I was so impressed by the things that I saw, by the willingness of just average men and women to try to do something in their own country. I came back to the United States so impressed by what I saw. And when the opportunity came to return overseas, I did that. And I ended up living in Ukraine and then Mongolia and then Indonesia, working with candidates to office, women who wanted to be in office, political party development, a lot of the activities funded by the US government to support democratic transformation.
Wonderful. And I'm wondering, given what we've seen in all of those countries where you've worked, as well as here in the US, Tova, you've spent quite a bit of your career studying the right to vote. And I'm wondering, what are you seeing in terms of sort of trends, gaps, opportunities, particularly around voter empowerment and suppression, right? And how you've seen it or maybe not seen it in this year's elections.
Yeah, I should say, just picking up on what Tom was talking about, I also did some consulting around elections in other countries around the world, and always felt like I wanted to write the book on the top 10 things other countries do better than the United States that nobody knows about, because I definitely learned as much from those other countries as they possibly learned from me about what goes into a strong election, whether it be on paper or in practice. So a lot of my analysis has been informed by that. But I would say that there's been a lot of bad and a lot of good. I mean, I think it's important that I distinguish between laws and policies in the United States and the politics that's going on in the United States, which are obviously overlapping and intertwined, but for me, separate in terms of making any kind of assessments, because I don't need to explain to anyone that the politics are bad and the campaigns were troubling. But on the process side, things went pretty well overall. It might have been a different situation if the outcome had been different, but I think election administrators in particular across the country should be particularly applauded for having worked 4 years to ensure that the elections process went smoothly and peacefully, and it did. Of course, there are ongoing issues with what I at least would term voter suppression, although that is a contested phrase. I would point particularly to the ongoing disenfranchisement of people who have served time for felony convictions as one of the areas in which the United States continues to disenfranchise people in ways that is contrary to international standards. And there are still millions of people in that position. And although that has improved and the laws have been reformed, it's still the case that there are millions of people disenfranchised. But there have been a lot of good things that have happened too. There are a lot of voting practices in this country that actually really impressed people in other places. And that's been a lot of work to make happen. Things like same-day registration, early voting that are not as present or familiar in other countries. So things have gone in both directions, and I guess we will be seeing very soon what direction they go in next.
Thank you for that. You know, we've seen that Freedom House at least concluded that most of the elections in this historic year have been generally free and fair. And so, Tom, as the world sort of shifts from the elections phase of things to the pragmatic reality of governing, what do you see as some of those key challenges for elected leaders, whether it's in sort of nascent democracies or well-established democracies, to really make sure that they're aligning with democratic governance standards?
Well, when I was working in Ukraine in the 1990s, Indonesia in the early 2000s, and as I've gone on to work in some, 80 countries around the world, I agree with Tova. We're learning as much or more from the people we're interacting with than I think we're necessarily sharing. And I think that is one of the important things. You asked about nascent as well as established democracies. There's really just sort of this equal balance now. It's no longer these nations of the global north or the west presenting lessons to countries that are still going through transition or younger democracies. It's really leveled out, I think, in this playing field around the world. I think when we look at the Republic of Korea in the last 2 weeks, so much to learn, not only from the candlelight revolution of a few years ago, but to learn from the way the people of Seoul and across Korea took to the streets to defend their democracy when they were suddenly presented with this martial law imposed or sought to impose upon them by their president. You mentioned this is a year of elections. It was a year of elections, super year of elections. And I think we really need to take a deeper dive. I think more research and analysis needs to be done into the anti-incumbency wave that prevailed. I know as we entered this year of elections, there were concerns that it would be a year in which we saw populists elected through the ballot box, that we saw authoritarian threats coming to us through elections. We did see that in one or two places, in a few places, but what we really saw was anti-incumbency. You saw the conservative government of the Republic of Korea decimated. You saw the liberal African National Congress in South Africa decimated at the polling place. And I think we need to understand that this anti-incumbency that took out the conservatives of Britain as well as the Democratic Party of the United States at the presidential level, it's reflecting this sense of distrust in institutions. And so I think as we move forward into 2025, as we move into governance, I think we need to try to look at important issues like decentralization. We need to look at how do we bring government closer to people? How do we bring government that people actually feel some faith and trust in? So that is something I think would be very important. I was in Ukraine last month in November, and I was there as part of a mission to look at democracy in wartime. And one of the things that we came away with was the importance, as soon as this unjustified invasion by Putin is brought to an end, is to really reinvigorate the decentralization process that was working so well in Ukraine before the full-scale invasion. And I think decentralization around the world is something we have to look at.
In a positive way or a negative way? I mean, I think people always almost joke about how decentralized the US system is, and there are good things and bad things about it.
Well, that's a very good point about the decentralization of the United States, the federalism. No, in a good way. I think when you look at, for instance, Ukraine, I think you look at the resistance that was made in those shocking days in February 2022, as people stayed, and they stayed usually led by a mayor in these small towns, and they blunted the force of the Russian assault. There's a reason that I think the Kremlin targeted Ukrainian mayors, many of whom were disappeared or imprisoned, tortured, killed. Decentralization, I really do think, is working in a place like Ukraine. And I think it goes hand in hand also with anti-corruption efforts that were being made in Ukraine, that, there were still issues, there were still problems, but a lot had been gained in Ukraine prior to 2022 in the fight against corruption. And so I see those as going hand in hand in trying to restore faith in institutions and trying to understand the anti-incumbency wave that swept across the world this year.
I definitely agree that lack of trust in institutions is a global phenomenon, and it certainly is the case in the United States. I've been curious as to the role of incumbency. It seems true that here and in other countries, a lot of this was about anti-incumbency and dissatisfaction with government. And I've been curious as to whether comparing all these different countries where the incumbents have been ousted makes sense, or can that be overstated? Because I have heard that, and everything seems so fluid right now, it's hard to tell.
Well, the United States does present challenges, as you've just mentioned, with the idea decentralization in Ukraine, I thought was a very positive aspect of their democratic transition. The United States decentralization in the election process, for instance, has led to, I think, some very serious challenges, state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. The United States, it is difficult to compare, I think, in many ways because of gerrymandering of our congressional districts, because of campaign finance laws. I think you look at this idea, aren't they saying now it was more than $4 billion spent in our presidential election? And then you look and it was literally in the low millions that was spent in the British election earlier this year. So yeah, it is very difficult when we start trying to contrast or compare the United States with a lot of other countries. But one thing I do know, going back to something I said a few minutes ago, there are lessons to be learned from around the world by the United States. And I do hope that we can analyze this year's elections, try to look at some of those good lessons learned and bring them home.
Yeah, completely. Maybe we can co-author this book I've been wanting to write, because I can come up with some examples. The top 10 list. There's probably more than 10.
I'm also wondering, both of you, sort of the tensions between decentralization and human rights protections, right? And those tend to sometimes get lost if it is really left to sort of varying degrees of popular support for them on the local level. Curious what you've seen in that context.
So it cuts both ways. I think it's problematic that we have a gazillion different systems of elections, a gazillion different number of rules that are different across jurisdictions, certainly state by state, but sometimes even county next to another county. And that can be problematic. It can lead to innovation and measures that make the election more inclusive and accessible. And it can also be used as a political weapon in some places to contract the electorate. So that's been a bit of a double-edged sword, I think. But I think certainly people are very eager to have some kind of understanding and consistent application of law, but it's tough under the circumstances. Another thing that, of course, the United States is very different than I think almost anywhere in the world, if not anywhere in the world, is we don't have a central election management body. And so all the vote counting, all the decisions are made at a very local level. And that has been something that when I've met with people from other countries, they're astonished. They say, who counts the votes? And I just I don't know, Associated Press, kind of at the end of the day. And that seems extraordinary. And so I don't think we'll have that, but certainly there's a lesson to be learned from countries that do have some kind of a nonpartisan election administration body that is able to be not political as much as possible.
I'm also curious, both of you mentioned aspects around eroded trust in institutions, and wondering if you have some examples or thoughts about how the role of law and lawyers can be mobilized in improving or increasing trust in institutions.
So there's been a tremendous amount of litigation around elections for the last 20 plus years now, more and more, it seems, each year. And I think that lawyers can play a really constructive role when it comes to litigation. And then there are occasions in which they have not played a constructive role. I think we've seen this year, but in previous years also, but this year surely, sort of bad faith litigation where lawyers groups will file litigation around issues that there really isn't any evidence behind the allegations, and it seems meant to tee up questions later on after the election. That's not helpful. But I think to the extent that lawyers are involved in representing people who may truly be disenfranchised, as well as serving as sort of ambassadors of trust in some ways in different states, as legal experts, assuring people that the process is sound, And so I think that there's a great role that lawyers can play in protecting the system. And there are certainly more lawyers who are doing that work than the ones who are doing things in bad faith.
And looking at the US from an international standards perspective, what is your assessment, if you will, around its alignment with global governance standards, especially around a couple of issues that have been raised in prior tapings we had around political party government separation, as well as around democratic checks and balances?
Yeah. And so Tova mentioned a moment ago that the process this year went smoothly. And of course, I think the process did go well. And I think it went well actually in 2020. But this time, I think we have sort of this window open to us in which the process went well. We're not going to likely be challenging it in large ways in the next couple of months. And I hope that we take this time to try to look at some of those areas that need revision, fixing. I look at the danger I've seen in multiple elections, and I've done dozens of election observations around the world, the danger in taking too long to count. And, that has so often led to such dangerous situations overseas. And I think it has been a problem here. Wasn't it only last week, I think, that we actually got the California final count on Congress? And that was very important because the House of Representatives is so narrowly divided right now between the two parties. It didn't result in the kind of danger, but it did result in perhaps the narrative being skewed somewhat. Is there a mandate or is there not a mandate? We're actually a very closely tied country. And I think that's something that would have been good to know a month ago. So California, Arizona, these kinds of places that take up to a month to count, that's state law. Back to this idea of too much decentralization, perhaps. But, we can look at Pennsylvania and we can see that that was a problem in 2020 and they fixed it.
They didn't totally fix it. They got better technology, but the law is still not great. And they're still working on that one.
Please, but I just feel like we're in sort of this window that, for whatever reason, we should go ahead and take advantage of that and try to look at issues on the count, a few things like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree with it having been improved this year. I said that about Pennsylvania because I know I wanted to sort of give a shout out to some of the cities there that did improve their technology and did improve their process as we kind of get used to more and more vote by mail, and including those with the provisional ballots. I think that there are definitely some adjustments that need to be made with respect to counting. But one other interesting thing that I'm glad you brought that up is that we have some research now that it is that time period between the end of election day and when the announcements are made about the vote count and who won, that is sort of that's the danger zone in a lot of ways, for it's a black hole where people can start cooking up all sorts of things about what is happening in this black box. And so some election administrators this year tried to do some pre-bunking of misconceptions about what happens during the vote count. And the press was very good also about explaining to people why we didn't necessarily always have all the votes counted right away. And that was helpful. So obviously, whatever we can do to try and speed that up while keeping it accurate and accessible is something definitely to be worked on.
Well, the National Democratic Institute, which is a sister organization to the International Republican Institute, and they're both part of the National Endowment for Democracy family of institutes, I think just played such a critical role, along with groups like Carter Center, over the last few decades in creating a homegrown and indigenous effort to release a quick count. And I think the quick count in so many places in which, again, a locally led, locally composed body of citizens, of voters, actually gets a very good quick count and gets it out. Sometimes the Central Election Commission of a country takes a very long time in doing the official count. But I think that has gone a long ways towards preserving calm in a number of countries. But the long count is just always a precarious matter.
Any other thoughts around the democratic checks and balances and how we may look at them, particularly in the US, where we're really seeing very little daylight between political party and government separation. And what you've seen maybe, Tom, in other countries, or maybe some thoughts, Tova, about what differently can be done here.
From the US perspective, I think it's time to get serious about getting away from winner take all and the two parties having the exclusive run of the place. It's a long-term battle. It's a long-term effort, but I think that people may become more convinced that we need some kind of a proportional representation system that will allow people to actually vote for candidates and parties that they really feel aligned with. And that will also be a way to perhaps get the major parties to not become extreme the way I would argue, at least, that some of the Republican Party has become. There would be alternatives to that, and perhaps on the left as well.
And I think very definitely, I would agree. Most of the countries I've worked in around the world have a proportional system. They have a system in which your vote counts for more than if you just cast it and your candidate loses and then you're out. And I know here in the jurisdiction I vote in, we had ranked choice voting on the ballot, and it was not supported by the two political parties, but it won. And so it has its own set of issues, I realize, but I'm looking forward to seeing what it means in effect next time. And it's especially important in places where we see one party control. And, we see a lot of places with one party control that's done according to the books. It's not a violation of any type of law or standard, but it's very definitely where a lot of our issues are coming from, places where there's not choice, where there's not a sense that, I cast my vote, my side didn't win, we have a chance still to engage in politics and engage in governance.
It's interesting, this idea that often leaders might be following, if you will, the letter of the law. And yet we've seen in a lot of contexts the co-optation, right, of law for means that are really anti-democratic in essence, following the law in letter but not in spirit, and leading to erosion of protection of rights or actually over time institutions such as the judiciary. We've seen that in Poland until the recent elections, right, with reforms so-called there. So it's wondering if you have any thoughts about contexts where the law is actually being co-opted to ultimately, if you will, anti-democratic means.
Well, again, we have these situations where we're seeing super majorities, where we're seeing, I think right now there's 6 or 7 African nations that have free and fair elections, or to use the term, they have, fair elections, yet one party has governed for decades. And this is just such a vulnerability in these countries' democracies. And one of the troubling things I think we've seen in the last year is Beijing has, for instance, started a political party school in Africa. And this political party school has taken these 6 nations, taken the ruling party, only the ruling party, not the opposition parties, and does training with them more or less to follow a Beijing model of one party over the state, one party over the courts. This, I think, we're going to see more and more of if we don't start to see more competition. And I'm concerned actually about the lack of competition in the United States Congress. What we saw in this last election, I think it was less than 40, certainly, House seats were actually considered competitive. Do we penalize the victors? Do we penalize those who have taken a legal system and made it work? We have to do something. Civil society, civics education. We need to do more to try to address this imbalance, which leads to nothing really good.
That's right. I'll open the floor to any sort of final thoughts or comments from either one of you. Maybe something more optimistic than than we're going downhill fast.
I can think optimistic.
I'll let Tova be optimistic.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, it's against my nature, but I've been doing it somewhat lately. One of the things that I do talk about, and I mean, perhaps this is a little bit contrary to what we were saying about decentralization and whether it's good or bad earlier, but I look a lot at what's going on in the states. And while there certainly have been a lot of laws passed in the last decade or so that have restricted voting rights, there have been some huge victories for people who want to expand the electorate in the states. And this includes in New Mexico and Minnesota, in Michigan, in Nevada, in Colorado. There have been tremendous successes with most of those places, omnibus election law reform that has made pathways to participation more accessible to more groups of people. And so I do feel optimistic that we can use this moment, among many other things, to support greater inclusion at the state and local level, and as the battles continue at the federal level.
And I would just say that, again, back in this year, this super year of elections, there were a number of instances in which the incumbent party abused powers of incumbency to really make the playing field highly unequal, yet still a challenger won. I think of Pakistan. Of course, they weren't allowed then to serve by the deep state, but Pakistan, I think, where Imran Khan's political party did so well. I think of Senegal. I think of Poland last year, where I was living when I was with the Community of Democracies. The government of Poland last year, they structured the ballot in such a way they couldn't lose, but they did. And I just feel like elections still give us this shot at letting peaceful transition of power occur, letting people peacefully express their aspirations and their political choice. And so I'm looking forward to a deeper analysis once the year is over. And I think we can take this and we're going to be able to take findings from what happened in 2024, and we're going to be able to make more equitable and more inclusive and participatory political systems.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. And for our listeners, for more resources on global elections and democratic governance standards and links to organizations, including in the US and around the world, who work on elections, please visit our International Law Community webpage. And again, thank you all for joining us for this series on the most foundational of all legal rights in a democracy, the right to vote. A right that requires a constellation of human and civil rights to be fully realized, and which activates the duty for rights-affirming governance. We look forward to our international law community members joining in efforts to uphold those principles here and around the world. Thank you all.
This episode of Brief Encounters was brought to you in part by our sponsor, CasePeer. Learn more about CasePeer in the description of this episode.